I've got a family now, so I'm getting a divorce. Take the kid and get out. Oh, and just so you know, I won't pay a dime in compensation."
Next to Greg, Susan was nodding in agreement. Their attitudes seemed to suggest that I was the one who was mistaken. Only the babies in the strollers, unaware of anything, slept peacefully. Greg didn't help at all when Emma was born. He spent his days playing around, and eventually he even started dipping into Emma's school funds. Despite never fulfilling his duties as a father, Greg got to enjoy himself and start a new family. Did he ever consider how Emma and I felt? As various thoughts raced through my mind and left me unable to speak, Emma pointed to the TV that had been left on and said, "Huh? Aren't you watching TV, Dad?" At her words, Greg ended up yelling loudly. My name is Jennifer Hansen. I am a housewife in my 50s. I live with my husband, Greg, and my daughter, Emma. I met Greg after graduating from college at the company where we both started working as fresh graduates.
"Is there something stuck? If you don't understand something, don't hesitate to ask."
I was actually assigned a different senior with more experience as my mentor. However, seeing me tense and unable to speak well, it was Greg who approached me. Greg patiently explained the things I was stuck on, and from then on, I naturally began to ask him about various things. As time went by, we quickly grew closer. Eventually, Greg confessed his feelings to me.
"I fell for your dedication to your work. Would you like to date me?"
"I'd love to." Since I have feelings for Greg as well, we started dating and quickly got married. A few years later, we were blessed with Emma. However, it wasn't always fun and games. In fact, it would be no exaggeration to say that there were many painful days. The cause was Greg's infidelity. It was around the time I got pregnant with Emma. Until then, Greg had cherished me deeply. When he learned of my pregnancy, he even teared up and said,
"Thank you."
I had severe morning sickness, and the smell of food alone made me nauseous. After the wedding, upon Greg's insistence, I had quit my job. Greg was up for a promotion at the time, so I accepted his request. As a full-time housewife, I was in charge of all the household chores. Being at home, I felt it was only natural to do so, but cooking in such a poor physical condition was indeed painful. Hey, I'm sorry to ask, but could we eat out or buy ready-made meals for a while? It was difficult to say that as someone tasked with the household duties, but I gathered my courage and approached Greg, who was relaxing in the living room. Greg frowned for a moment and asked in a serious tone,
"Why? You're a housewife, aren't you? You're not working, so you have to do the household chores properly. Otherwise, you're just a leech."
Indeed, what Greg said was true. After all, I was living on Greg's money. It was only fair to expect me to do the household chores in return. But I couldn't do what I couldn't do, and it wasn't that I was being lazy. Desperately, I tried to convey my feelings to Greg. "I feel nauseous from the morning sickness. Just smelling food makes me want to throw up. Really, it's hard to do any household chores when my belly is so heavy and uncomfortable."
"Shut up. That's just an excuse. You're a housewife, so do your household chores properly. How will you take care of me if you keep up with such a diet? It's your job to think about nutritional balance and prepare meals full of love to welcome your husband."
Overwhelmed by his harsh words, I felt dizzy on the spot. I wasn't asking for his help every day, but Greg could have helped a bit with the chores on his days off, just like he relaxed in the living room. No matter how desperately I tried to convey my feelings, Greg wouldn't listen. So, enduring my heavy belly and nausea, I managed to get the household chores done. It was a continuous hell, but still, when Emma was born, I felt as if those painful days were finally over. At the same time, I was moved by the sight of Emma crying in the delivery room. Greg, saying he had work, didn't come to the hospital or even respond to my calls. Seeing his behavior, the nurses also seemed somewhat uncomfortable, but while holding Emma, I could forget all the unpleasantness. I decided from the bottom of my heart to protect this child for the rest of my life. I would make sure she lived without hardship no matter what. As expected, Greg didn't participate in parenting at all. To ensure I had enough funds to raise Emma, I put her in daycare and started working from home. Of course, I had discussed this with Greg.
"What kind of job can an old lady with no skills do from home? It's almost like playing. It won't earn much, but do whatever you like."
Without even listening to what the job entailed, Greg mocked me. Honestly, it was frustrating, but now I just use that feeling as motivation to work hard. "Daddy, play with me." Greg was just relaxing in the living room as usual on his days off, and Emma sometimes called out to him. If it were me, I would have smiled and played with her right away, but Greg looked annoyed and shooed her away.
"Daddy is busy. I don't have time to play with you. Ask Mom to play.
Saying that, he quickly got ready and left. Lately, I had noticed that Greg's outings had increased. Not just on weekends, but even on weekdays. He seemed to come home later. I checked the salary details, but there was no sign of overtime. Having worked there myself, I knew the company didn't demand excessive unpaid overtime. Could it be an affair? That thought crossed my mind, and I immediately hired a detective. It turned out that Greg was indeed involved in an affair with another woman. Greg, Emma is here too. What are you thinking? This is unacceptable for a father. Let's get a divorce. Filled with anger, I thrust the divorce papers at him. However, trying to appease me, Greg said,
Divorce is the only thing. And what about Emma? If she grows up without a father from such a young age, it could affect her personality.
Honestly, I was worried about that. If we divorced now, Emma would end up being raised by a single parent. Even if it didn't affect her personality, she could be teased at school. But that didn't calm my anger. It seemed we would definitely end up divorcing. However, something made me reconsider the divorce. It was Emma's sleep talking. Daddy, let's play. While breathing softly in her sleep, Emma murmured this in a small voice. Since Greg's affair had been discovered, there had been a tense atmosphere in the house. Emma must have sensed it somehow. Even so, this child was still seeking her father. Overwhelmed by her bravery, I felt tears fall and was disgusted with myself for nearly taking her father away from her in my anger. I decided that when Emma no longer needed a father, that would be the time for divorce. I resolved to demand a higher than usual compensation from the affair partner and set a condition for Greg to spend time with Emma once a week, and decided not to divorce. It turned out that Greg had covered the affair partner's compensation payment, but that didn't matter to me. As long as both were hit hard, that was enough. After that, Greg did indeed spend time with Emma once a week as promised. However, it didn't last long. I felt like complaining that this wasn't what we had agreed upon, but since our relationship had been repaired and we were no longer fighting daily, I couldn't bear to dredge up the past and make Emma suffer again. Time just passed and we entered our 50s. Emma, who we had cherished so much, had turned 20, found a job, and was living on her own. Greg had been on a solo assignment overseas for the past 3 years, so I ended up spending time alone at home. Concerned about me, Emma had been living at home even after getting a job. Since his solo assignment, Greg rarely showed his face at home. Gradually, Greg's presence faded from our lives. That day was Emma's day off from work, and we were leisurely spending time watching TV and eating snacks. Then the doorbell rang. Yes? When I checked, there stood Greg and a young blonde woman holding a stroller. At a glance, she seemed about Emma's age. Twin babies were sleeping soundly in the stroller. Not understanding what was going on just from the video, I hesitantly opened the front door to let them in. Nice to meet you, ma'am. I'm Susan Holmes. I've been seeing Greg. Her words stunned me. This man had betrayed his family not just once, but twice, and this time with someone as young as his daughter. The fact that a man in his 50s was doting on such a young partner was unbelievable to the point of making me nauseous. Seeing me speechless, Greg probably felt the shock and said with a shallow smile,
I've got a family now, so I'm getting a divorce. Take the kid and get out. Oh, and just so you know, I won't pay a dime in compensation.
Oh, Greg, that's terrible. Greg and Susan both looked at me, unable to say anything, and seemed to be almost laughing at me. Only the sleeping babies in the stroller were oblivious, breathing peacefully. Their behavior reminded me of Emma's sleep talking from that time. However, as I was silently watching, Emma suddenly pointed at the TV. Huh? Dad, aren't you watching the TV? At her words, everyone's gaze turned to the TV. The screen displayed a news headline. Today's hot topic, the female CEO with rumored annual sales of $500 million. The camera switched to the interviewee. Seeing it, Greg suddenly shouted,
What does this mean? Why are you on the TV?
Yes, the female CEO being interviewed was me. After Emma started daycare, I began working from home. At first, it was really just small jobs, but as work began to pick up, I founded a company to help others like me find good projects. It was uncertain at first, but there seemed to be a demand, and business grew significantly. 2 years ago, it became a listed company. Now, it's considered a dream company for those in the same field, with constant job applications and project requests. Explaining this, Greg's face turned pale. Susan, who was momentarily flustered, quickly tried to cover for him. But Greg, you're making money too, right? Maybe not $500 million, but you said you're a department head and might be promoted soon? Hearing this, I couldn't help but say, what? It seemed that Greg had been telling tall tales to impress Susan. He's just an ordinary employee, though. What? Indeed, there had been talk of Greg's promotion at the beginning of our marriage. However, that prospect has since disappeared because Greg had embezzled company funds. Even if it was a small amount, embezzlement is embezzlement. Greg crying over the terrible mistake he had made seemed pitiable to me, and I repeatedly apologized to the CEO and repaid several times the amount embezzled with interest. Of course, the money came from my savings. Thanks to a certain connection with the CEO who took pity on my desperate pleas, it was agreed that Greg would continue to be employed on the condition that he would never be promoted, no matter what. I'm truly grateful to the CEO, but I also feel like I made unnecessary efforts. In the end, Greg could not get promoted, so of course, there was no chance he could become a department head. Probably he lied to make himself look better to Susan. When I exposed this, Susan's face turned pale. Why did you lie about that? You weren't a department manager? Just an ordinary employee? That's unbelievable. I wouldn't have done this if I had known. Susan screamed as if she was having a tantrum. Tears in his eyes, Greg also pleaded.
I had no choice. I just wanted to catch your attention, Susan. I really loved you.
Watching two grown adults in such a meltdown was quite unsightly. Amidst this chaos, Emma came from her room with an envelope and spread its contents on the table. Actually, I knew Dad was cheating. Everyone present, including myself, gasped in surprise at Emma's words. According to her, the trigger was when Greg, who was supposed to be on a business trip abroad, was spotted by one of her friends within the country. After confirming that the person in the photos was indeed Greg, Emma immediately hired a detective to start an investigation. She explained the situation to my parents and managed to cover the costs. She decided to monitor Greg's movements, focusing on the locations where he had been spotted. This led to a plethora of evidence of his infidelity. However, she didn't have the heart to report it to me. What if it shocked me too much? Moreover, the person Greg was cheating with was almost the same age as her. Emma thought it would cause me great emotional distress, so she decided to wait and see. Amidst all this, such an incident occurred. Documents and photos indicating Greg and Susan's affair were laid out densely on the table. Seeing this, both of them turned red, but Emma continued to speak. Honestly, what Dad has done is despicable. Betraying Mom and secretly starting a family elsewhere is absolutely unforgivable. I barely have any memories of staying with him, but now I'm thoroughly disappointed. Emma must be feeling indescribable disgust. I too felt it was a waste to spend any more time on these people. I just wanted to settle things quickly, but for that, they needed to face some consequences. Of course, I plan to demand compensation, and on top of that, I'll have a word with the president. When I mentioned the president, Greg's face turned ashen. No wonder. The president refers to the head of the company where Greg works. If this matter comes to light, Greg, who has already caused trouble, will likely be fired this time. Wait, how can you even contact the president directly? You're just a former ordinary employee. You shouldn't have that kind of authority. That's because it's true, as Susan said, that normally a mere former employee wouldn't be able to contact a company president directly. Why I could do that has to do with my relationship with the president. My father and the president are childhood friends. At this, Greg and Susan both exclaimed in surprise. I had never told this to Greg.
What do you mean? I've never heard about this.
There's not much to it. My father has been friends with the president for a long time, which is why I was able to get a job at that company. Oh, and don't get me wrong, it wasn't a connection-based hiring, but it was also why I could do something when Greg embezzled funds. Though it was all in vain. I wonder what the president will think when he finds out how much his friend's daughter has been hurt. As I said this with exaggerated calmness, Greg's face went from blue to pale white. That makes sense. If I speak to the president, Greg might be fired in no time. Already guilty of embezzlement, if he loses his current job, finding another one would likely be impossible. If that happens, he'll truly be lost. Since Susan alone probably couldn't support the twins and cover the entire family's living expenses, it would mean downfall for the whole family. What do you mean? I thought marrying you as a manager meant a secure future. I thought I could live easily. What are you going to do about this now? Facing reality, Susan turned bright red and grabbed Greg by the collar. No surprise there. She thought it was a golden opportunity, but it turned out to be just a braggart. While being shaken by Susan, Greg desperately tried to keep smiling. Of course, his face remained pale.
But think about it. If we have love, we can overcome this, right? We have a family. We should pull together for our family. I believe we could do that with you, Susan.
Such a poor attempt at persuasion. However, such sweet talk won't sway Susan. To Susan, it seems there was no real interest in Greg himself, just in the wealth she thought he had. Chances of a young woman genuinely falling for a man in his 50s are slim, unless he looked somewhat appealing. Greg, with a belly befitting his age and a greasy look, would not be someone I'd date, even if I were younger. I'll never forgive you. No marriage. Make sure you pay child support. These kids are yours after all.
What? Weren't you going to marry me? This isn't what we agreed on.
At Susan's words, Greg pleaded tearfully. But then Emma interjected. But those kids, are they even dads? What do you mean? Confused by Emma's words, I tilted my head. Then Emma pulled something else out of the envelope. It seemed there was still some evidence she hadn't shown yet. Ah, stop! As Emma revealed the item, Susan screamed piercingly and threw herself across the table. At that moment, a photo fluttered down. In the photo, Susan was seen walking in a hotel district with an unknown man. You were seeing another man besides Greg?
What?
At my words, Greg snatched the photo from my hands. Seeing it, Greg's face turned red and he yelled at Susan.
What is this about? You were betraying me too, weren't you? I was seriously in love with you, Susan, and yet you go messing around with other men?
It's not like that. It's not like that.
Shut up. Those kids probably aren't even mine. I won't acknowledge them as mine until we do a DNA test.
At Greg's words, Susan started sobbing bitterly. To think she would cheat and possibly even try to trick him into raising another man's child. Despite being the same age as Emma, it was almost impressive how cunning she could be. With the evidence of infidelity, demanding compensation won't be a problem. It's unlikely that Greg and Susan can repair their relationship now. Just when I thought everything was settled, Greg suddenly started to prostrate himself. What are you trying to do? As I asked, Greg cried out desperately.
I've realized only Jennifer is right for me. I love only Jennifer. I might not have been a good husband before, but I'll do better this time. Please, let's try again. I can't do it without you, Jennifer.
What does he mean, he can't do it without me? If that were true, he wouldn't have gone after Susan. Hearing him say this now doesn't move me at all. Sorry, but I have no intention of withdrawing the divorce. Emma and I will leave this house. I'll send the divorce papers by mail, so please sign them and submit them. With that, I returned to my room. Emma seemed to understand what she needed to do as well and went back to her own room. After spending some time preparing our belongings, Susan and the baby were gone, but Greg was sobbing alone in the living room.
Please reconsider. Don't leave me alone.
Despite his pleas, we ignored him completely. Emma and I left the house together. For the time being, we decided to stay in a hotel. Once we find a house, we'll move there immediately. The divorce papers have been sent, and I've already consulted a lawyer. If there's any delay in the submission of the divorce papers, we can consult about that too. I felt as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Emma was attending work as usual. Initially, I had suggested that we look for separate places, but apparently Emma thinks I'm too lonely, saying, "Let's live together in the new house." I'm relying on Emma as we look for a new house, work, and sometimes go out together. Without the troublesome presence of Greg, I have more enjoyable time with Emma. This time is the first since I got married that I can enjoy various things wholeheartedly and without any worries. However, such happy times won't last forever. It was a weekday and I was at the office. After confirming the day's schedule with my secretary, I began to tackle the day's work on my computer. During work, my smartphone started ringing loudly. It was Greg. Of course, since it was work hours, I couldn't answer. I always tried to keep work and private life separate. So I ignored it, and eventually it stopped. But then it started ringing again. Once it stopped, it started again. It was a continuous cycle. So annoying. Annoyed by the constant disturbance, I decided to answer the still ringing calls after returning to the hotel. It seems that looking at the call history, he had been calling continuously since I first noticed. Before I could say hello, I heard Greg's desperate cries.
Help! The house! I'm going to lose the house!
Hearing Greg's words, I honestly sighed. Is that all? That's only natural, isn't it? After all, that house isn't in your name. Yes, the ownership of the house we had lived in as a family was in my name. To be exact, it was in both Greg's and my name when we signed the contract. However, after Greg embezzled money and it became clear he wouldn't be promoted, we decided it would be difficult to continue mortgage payments, so we changed the title to my name. Thus, I have been the one paying for the mortgage alone. Since Greg contributed only a tiny amount, it was only natural to evict him if I no longer lived there. It's obvious, yet he didn't even realize that. It seems I have been too lenient with Greg for too long. If I had expressed my intentions more clearly, would the future have been different? After hearing my words, Greg seemed to recall those events and clung desperately, but it was pathetic.
Do something. The president even announced I'm fired. If this continues, I'll lose not just my job but my home too. How am I supposed to live?
That's none of my concern. Why don't you figure it out yourself? This situation is entirely the result of Greg's own doing. If he hadn't betrayed our family, we could have continued living together even if we weren't close. That he couldn't is entirely Greg's fault. Yet he refuses to accept his sins and clings disgracefully. How can he continue to show such an appalling side of himself? Even though he shows such a state, I won't sympathize. For me, the relationship with Greg is over. Honestly, I'm so averse to dealing with him that I decide to end it clearly. If he delays submitting the divorce papers, I'll sue you. That will make finding a job even harder, won't it? How sad. And with compensation to pay, are you sure you'll be all right? At my words, Greg gasped on the other side of the phone. To twist the knife further, I added, "Oh, and about the president, he seemed angrier than I thought. It looks like he is spreading the word about you everywhere. Isn't that nice? You're not a celebrity."
No. Please do something. If that happens, I'm finished.
Greg's voice was colored with despair. It was so amusing that I couldn't help but smile. But all of this is Greg's fault. Greg, who has betrayed Emma and me for years. Marrying Greg was probably a mistake in the first place. Why did I ever marry such a person? I deeply regret being attracted to Greg in my younger days. I don't know what to tell you. You brought this on yourself, right? I'm going to hang up now. I'll send you my lawyer's contact information later, so please communicate through them from now on. Goodbye.
Wait, Jennifer, don't abandon me.
After Greg's plea, I hung up the phone. The ringtone sounded several more times, but I quickly blocked Greg's contact and sent only the lawyer's information before blocking him. This way, Greg can no longer contact me. I decided to tell Emma to block his contact as well, feeling relieved that things were finally settled. What I heard from the lawyer later was that initially Greg hesitated to submit the divorce papers, but when he heard it might go to court, he submitted them quietly. However, the matter didn't end there. To pay the compensation to me, Greg borrowed a large sum of money from dubious sources. You might wonder why he would do that, but following this incident, his parents disowned him. Having already set things up with his friends, Greg had no one to turn to, and ended up going to those people out of desperation. Though he managed to pay the compensation, he couldn't repay his debts and was eventually taken away by some shady characters. I heard through the grapevine that he's now working on a tuna fishing boat. I also demanded compensation from Susan. However, her parents ended up paying for it. I might have felt that it didn't impact her much, but her parents, furious about the incident, are now controlling all her income. Despite her youth, Susan cannot spend her salary freely, and her beauty is reportedly fading. Apparently, the babies from that time were not Greg's children after all. They are now being taken care of by Susan's parents. When I met them in the presence of a lawyer, they seemed like decent people, so I'm confident those twins will grow up just fine. I quietly breathed a sigh of relief. Since then, I've been leisurely going about my work days. Actually, Emma works as an office clerk at my company. Although she is my daughter, I don't show her any favoritism, but she is quite a competent employee, beloved by everyone in the office. One day, Emma said to me, "I have something to tell you." Worried it might be some misconduct, my heart raced, but when I saw the young man standing next to her, my face softened. "I've decided to get married." Saying that, Emma blushed. As a parent, I feel I've caused her a lot of trouble. I've surely made her go through a lot of hard times. Yet hearing my daughter's happiest news, tears started to fall. "Mom, you're getting ahead of yourself. That's for the wedding, right?" Emma took out a handkerchief and wiped my tears. Seeing me cry embarrassingly, the young man beside her smiled and said,
"What a wonderful mother."
There were many times I wanted to run away from all the hardships, but I could overcome them because I had Emma. I intend to continue being a mother she can be